The content in this video is for general educational use. It does not represent political opinions or judgments about any country, culture, or government. Information is based on publicly available sources and may be summarized or simplified. Viewers should verify details through multiple sources.
So, today we're going to dive into one of the absolute worst catastrophes of the 20th century, the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933. It's known as the Holodomor. We're going to look at what the historical accounts tell us and what modern analysis has uncovered to really understand not just what happened, but how it happened and, most importantly, why. All right, let's get into it.
We are dying. Just 3 words. But those were the words that Ukrainian peasants whispered to a young Welsh journalist named Gareth Jones. He was traveling secretly through the countryside back in 1933. It's such a simple, haunting phrase, and it just cuts right to the bone, straight to the heart of the huge human tragedy we're about to unpack.
And here is where the whole story gets completely turned on its head. This was not a famine caused by some natural disaster, like a drought or a massive flood. No, this was a famine in Ukraine, a land famous for its incredibly fertile black earth, a place that for centuries had been called the breadbasket of Europe. So the question you have to ask is, how on earth is that even possible? The stories that came out of this time, they're just nightmarish. Gareth Jones, that journalist, he wrote about seeing bread lines with more than 1,000 people waiting for 2 days straight, and often for absolutely nothing. He saw homeless kids just wandering the streets in rags, covered with the sores of diseases. Other eyewitnesses talked about trucks that would just cruise through the cities at night to pick up the bodies from doorways and bridges. Entire villages were literally blockaded by the authorities. And desperate peasants who tried to escape to Poland or Romania, they were shot by Soviet border patrols. To really wrap our heads around how this happened, we have to look at the specific Soviet policies that turned this breadbasket into a death trap, because this wasn't an accident. This was the direct result of a series of very deliberate actions by the state. Okay, so it all starts with this one massive policy: collectivization. Beginning back in 1928, Joseph Stalin's regime forced millions and millions of peasants to give up their private land, their tools, even their farm animals, and join these huge state-controlled collective farms. In effect, it just stripped them of everything they owned and their ability to make their own decisions. It turned them into little more than laborers for the state, working on the very same land their families had farmed for generations.
And here is exactly how that policy was turned into a weapon. First, Stalin himself called the state's grain quotas the first commandment. That meant the collective farms had to give the state its share before they could pay their own workers a single thing. And these quotas? They weren't just unrealistic, they were purposely jacked up higher and higher in a policy Stalin called G'ing up, just to squeeze every last grain out of the countryside. When farms couldn't meet these impossible targets, brigades of party activists were sent in. And they didn't just take the grain, they took everything: potatoes, beets, any food they could find. And to top it all off, a truly brutal law was passed, nicknamed the 5 Years of Wheat Law. It made it a crime, punishable by death, for a starving person to take even a handful of grain from the fields they were forced to work in. Now, what's really fascinating and, frankly, terrifying about this is the mindset of the people who were actually enforcing these rules. This guy, Lev Kopelev, he was one of those young, idealistic party activists. He genuinely believed he was a warrior on an invisible front. In his head, he wasn't starving people. He was fighting kulak sabotage. Kulaks was the term for supposedly rich peasants. He thought he was building a better, socialist future. This quote just shows you the incredibly powerful and dangerous role that ideology can play in justifying unimaginable cruelty.
But here's the thing. This wasn't just about grain or bad economic policy. Not by a long shot. The evidence we have now strongly suggests it was also a political weapon, aimed squarely at crushing a threat to Soviet power: Ukrainian nationalism. And we don't have to guess at the motive. We don't have to speculate, because we have it right here, in Stalin's own words. In August of 1932, he wrote a letter to his top enforcer, Lazar Kaganovich, and in it, he said that without taking decisive action, we could lose Ukraine. You see, he didn't see the resistance to his policies as an economic problem.
He saw it as a political threat, a nationalist threat, that had to be stamped out. His goal was to make Ukraine a real fortress of the USSR. This slide just lays it out so starkly. You can see just how sudden and targeted this political attack really was. Before the famine, the Soviets had actually been promoting Ukrainian culture. It was a policy called Ukrainization. But then, bam, right at the height of the famine, in December 1932, that policy was viciously reversed. The Ukrainian language was suppressed, and its culture was branded a threat. The timing of it all, it makes the motive pretty undeniable. And the attack didn't stop there. While millions were starving in the villages, the Soviet secret police launched this massive crackdown on Ukraine's cultural and intellectual leaders. We're talking writers, teachers, scientists, even Ukrainian Communist Party officials. Some of the most prominent figures, like Mykola Skripnik, who had championed Ukrainization, were hounded until they took their own lives. This wave of terror, happening at the exact same time as the famine, became known as the Executed Renaissance. So while all of this is happening on the ground, a completely different kind of war was being fought on the world stage. It was a war over the truth itself. The question is, could a catastrophe of this magnitude really be hidden from the rest of the world? And here you have the two main players in that war for the truth. On one side, you've got Gareth Jones, the journalist who blew the whistle on the famine after his secret trip, telling the world about death to millions by hunger. And on the other side, you've got Walter Duranty, the New York Times' very influential man in Moscow. He immediately went to work trying to discredit Jones, publishing this infamous article titled "Russians Hungry But Not Starving," and basically just parroting the official Soviet line. It's a shocking contrast that shows you just how hard the Soviets worked to hide what was really going on. So let's be crystal clear about this. In the eyes of the Soviet state, the famine simply did not exist. It never happened. In all their official documents, this mass death was just glossed over with these bizarre euphemisms like food difficulties or difficulties on the collectivization front. And this campaign of denial was absolutely critical. It stopped any international aid from coming in and allowed the terror to just keep going. So for decades, the world has debated this. Was this a horrific tragedy that spun out of a terrible policy, or was it something much, much darker? Well, thanks to the opening of Soviet archives and modern research, the picture is becoming much, much clearer. And this brings us right to the central question that historians and legal scholars have been grappling with for years. Was the Holodomor a famine, a tragic but maybe unintended result of a brutal economic policy? Or does the evidence point to a deliberate act of mass murder, a crime against humanity, and maybe even a genocide? Okay, let's look at the hard data. A really groundbreaking study by the National Bureau of Economic Research went through all these newly available Soviet-era production numbers, and their main finding is just staggering. They found that, yeah, the harvest was lower than average, but Ukraine still produced enough grain in 1932 to feed its entire population and completely avoid a famine. The starvation was not caused by a lack of food. And this chart just breaks it down so clearly for us. It's just so simple. Look at the bar on the right. If the state hadn't taken any grain, there would have been over 1 kilogram of grain for every person every day. That's well above the survival level you see in that first bar. But then look at the middle bar. After the state took its quota, the amount of food left plummeted to just over 0.5 kilogram, way, way below what a person needs to live. The state's actions directly created the food shortage that led to mass starvation. And this might be the most damning statistic of all to come out of that economic research. When the scholars tried to figure out what caused the massive death toll, they found that things like a smaller harvest could only explain a tiny fraction of it. But when they factored in an anti-Ukrainian bias in Soviet policy, meaning policies that specifically took more grain from Ukrainian areas and blocked aid, that factor could explain up to 92% of the famine deaths. So, back in 1948, the United Nations officially defined the crime of genocide. Take a close look at subsection C there. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now think about everything we've just laid out. Stalin's fear of losing Ukraine, the simultaneous attack on Ukrainian culture, and the hard data showing that state policy, not crop failure, created the deadly food shortage. When you connect those dots to this legal definition, a very powerful and very chilling case emerges. The historian James Mace, a man who dedicated his life to studying the Holodomor, came to this conclusion.
The goal was nothing less than the destruction of the Ukrainian people as a political factor and as a social organism. It was a calculated attempt to break the back of the Ukrainian nation, to destroy it as a force that could ever challenge Moscow's absolute rule. It was, just as the title says, terror by hunger.